You'll notice that I'm in a natural surrounding, and I much prefer to do my teaching in a natural surrounding, and there's a really good reason for it. And that is, it is my experience that there is a more effective field of consciousness in nature. So much so that I often find myself saying to my students or my mentorees or others of my colleagues here in Drew saying a similar thing along the lines of, okay everybody, is it reasonable to say we swim in a sea of consciousness? Is it reasonable to say we swim in a sea of consciousness? And I look around the room or at the person in front of me and I watch nods all around, and it seems to make sense. And so I carry on. But I wonder whether it's just worth pausing and delving into this a little bit more. What on earth would I possibly mean? What on earth would my colleagues, friends, students, mentorees mean when they say, oh yeah, that makes sense? What's happening? What's the experience? Is it real, or are we just all delusional? Let's try and find this out. So, well, I guess the first place to start is, have you ever been thinking of somebody, and just when you're really poignantly thinking of them, the phone rings and there they are? Or you think, oh, I've just got this idea, I must take lunch to da 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 da, and this is the day they forgot their lunch. Or to your child, you just have the right thing to say at the right time, and suddenly the tears change to an expression of delight. And so the list goes on of experiences that seem to indicate we're somehow linked in a shared sea of consciousness. For an Indigenous elder, this is completely obvious. Yeah, well, of course, everything is conscious. I am as one with the bird that flies across my vision, as the tree that upholds the birds, as the sun in the sky, the earth beneath my feet, or the sacred site I go to shape my consciousness into the state I need for the next process of our evolution. It's obvious to any Indigenous elder that you talk to. And they wonder why the Westerners don't get it. So that's a good start. The Indigenous people of every tradition already experience that we swim in a sea of consciousness. What a beautiful concept. And you might have experienced it too. Have you ever been in a cathedral and suddenly a hush descends and you find yourself transported into stillness by the majesty of the place? Or have you been to a sacred site or just a special place to you in nature and found yourself and your consciousness resting in a particular shape of quiet, of stillness, of passion, of power? If you've traveled a lot like me, you might even notice that each country has its different feeling. The Australian landscape is all friendly and fiery. The Americans is all passionate and uplifting. The British filled with heart, and so on across the world. Amazing places have amazing fields of consciousness, or so it seems as you get more sensitive to the experience of consciousness. Interesting? So far so good? What about those transcendent moments you have when maybe listening to an orchestra that's particularly special, or a performer who really pours out their energy and their love across the stage into the audience? Or have you just gazed into the eyes of a child or a baby and lost yourself in love? Transcendent moments of consciousness. And if you're a Drew teacher or a Drew yoga practitioner, you've probably noticed, as with many yoga traditions, that there come moments in the class when everyone's consciousness seems to unite in a common ocean of stillness or love or connectedness, joy, or just simply being. Any of what I've been describing could be some of the most magical and transcendent moments of your life. And there they are, all seeming to indicate that we swim in a sea of consciousness. So, as an engineer, I've tried to explore how and why this happens. from a yogic point of view, we've discovered that you get a better experience and probability of this in a class if you have enabled the students in the class to feel connected with one another. And that's why it's a common hallmark of a Drew class that people feel that they're part of a group of friends, part of a support group, and they have the feeling of coming home when they walk into the class. And we've trained our teachers very carefully to be able to manage that situation and to harness the power which technically in Sanskrit is called the power of Vyan Vayu, the transport of consciousness that connects us all. Yoga has so much to say about all of this. So that's a start. This is what yoga and our personal experience has to say. But what about science? What does science have to say about this idea of swimming in a sea of consciousness? And perhaps the most famous of all illustrations and examples of this was performed at Princeton University in the States by the engineering department, who in the 1980s got rather fed up with all kinds of people coming to them and saying, I am the kind of person whose watch is always breaking, for whom computers always crash, etc. And they went, maybe actually this is a real phenomenon. Let's investigate it. So they set up all kinds of experiments, and in the end settled on one which seemed to produce the best results. And in this they had a computer with a horizontal line and a dot which would appear above or below the line at random. They would sit a person in front of it and ask them to try and influence whether the dot would go above or below the line. And then statistically they would measure whether there had been any difference from the random possibilities. And so off they went. Thousands of people later, they have some very powerful conclusions, which I always find completely staggering. And the conclusions are very simple. People can influence that dot. They don't even have to be in front of the computer. They can be in the next room, in the next campus, in the next city, in the next country, in the next continent. But those who influence the dot most effectively describe their ability to do that as being most effective when they are falling in love with the process. Hear that again, when they feel they are falling in love with the process. What a magical description of swimming in the sea of consciousness. I think we have so much to learn from this. And the experimenters and the researchers have explored what happens with space and found it makes no difference to our ability to allow our consciousness to intervene elsewhere in the planet. Have you prayed for someone and seen an amazing result? If so, you have been swimming in the sea of consciousness. And so there's so much more to say about this. Even today, dotted around 68, I think it is, points on our planet are random number generators like this, exploring what happens when the sea of consciousness of humanity as a collected whole changes because of some major event. When the millennium occurred, do you remember the next morning? Still, quiet, incredible. And that night, filled with a joy and a peacefulness all across the world that was hard to believe could occur. On that day, the random number generators experienced a massive peak as humanity's consciousness strangely affected the quantum field. And so it has gone on across the decades. Whenever there's a shared consciousness of humanity around the planet, there's a peak in the numbers that shows that somehow, by some amazing process, we're actually affecting the quantum state of the atoms creating these random number generators. It's a magical thing. So we live in a world, and the probability of that, I should say, is not just one chance in 100 that it's a real experience. It's not just one chance in 200 that it's a real experience. It's one chance in countless orders of magnitude that it's a real experience. It's a very powerful phenomenon. And our human minds are bright, they're powerful, and they make a difference. You make a difference. And I hope your yoga practice, your meditation practice, your prayer, or just your being will add something positive and beautiful to the swim that we all share in our sea of consciousness. May you swim beautifully in your and our sea of consciousness.